This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Freya Sirr.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show. Hi everybody. Well, today we'll be travelling to Strokestown to talk to Strokestown's International Poetry Festival director, Joseph Woods, about this year's programme and what it's going to offer poetry lovers this May bank holiday weekend in Strokestown House. But first, at the breakfast table, we want to welcome back poet and Irish Times reviewer Adam Wyeth. Sounds great, doesn't it, Adam? To talk with us about recent poetry publications that have grabbed his attention. Adam is himself an award-winning and critically acclaimed poet, playwright and essayist with 5 books published with Salmon Poetry, and we're delighted to have him with us this morning. Adam, first off, I can see you're sitting there with tons of books on the table. We thought we'd head west to the acclaimed poet of the Western Seaboard, Rita Ann Higgins, whose Jiving with Wasps, her new and selected poems, have just been published by Blood Axe. It's a really handsome collection, and it draws on dozens of books of poetry published by her over 4 decades, including her books from Salmon Press, which is really great, I think. They originally published her, and so books included are Goddess on the Merview Bus, which came out in 1986, right up to The Long Weekend in 2024. So it's a really comprehensive collection, and it includes new poems which appear for the first time, which is also a great thing. So how does it hold up, do you think, Adam, as a complete picture of Rita Ann Higgins' career?
Yeah, well, it's a great doorstopper of a book, first of all, gathering work, as you say, across 4 decades. And what you get here feels very close to a collected. And I've been reading Rita Ann Higgins for many years, like many people, and she's been, a very big presence on the Irish poetry scene, of course. But she's someone I haven't read in great detail in recent years. So this new selected is a wonderful opportunity to return to her work and to see in a more sustained way just how powerful a figure she is. And what really strikes me, reading across these 40 years, is the sense of evolution, not just in her own voice, but in the island she's writing out of. Ireland was a very different place 40 years ago, and Higgins is documenting and responding to that change in a way that's both personal and social. So it's a great read.
Actually, that was one of my opening kind of questions. Was just that, because it is that reach of 40 years. I mean, the book opens with a poem from 1986, and I'm just wondering what does that early work tell us about kind of where she was coming from and the Ireland she was coming from?
Yeah, well, she really hit the ground running. I mean, that first collection coming out in 1986 with Salmon Poetry. And I think the first poem in the collection, in the selected, is Consumptive in the Library. And it's a brilliant place to begin because you immediately hear immediately hear Higgins's voice, which is sharp, funny, irreverent. And it really announces the fresh voice, which is aware of the literary world she's stepping into. So the poem sets up this kind of dual portrait. You get this about you and about me, this man and this poet, this woman, the speaker, and it's full of these wonderful specific details. And what's so interesting is that both these figures are carrying things. The you carries these physical, social, almost talismanic objects, and also this bodily condition, the cough. And then the me carries something else. There's literary ambition, there's guilt and anxiety, and then there's an anthology of Ulster poets. So already she's setting up this parallel between bodily affliction and poetic aspiration. So poetry becomes just another thing to carry around with you, perhaps like an illness or a wound. And then you get this line, you get these references. I started with Heaney, you started to cough. You coughed all the way to Ormsby. I was on the verge of Mahon. So poetry itself becomes something you ingest or perhaps something you choke on. And then the poem ends with, I moved to the medical section.
You're reading that poem, she mentions Heaney, she mentions Mahon, she mentions Frank Ormsby. Is there a sense of her kind of being in this very male?
Well, that's exactly it. You have to remember this is, 1986, so it was largely dominated by male voices. So, you had these great figures like Ivan Boland and Nuala Nagonal, but Higgins is coming from a very different place altogether. Leaving school at 14, outside that academic middle-class literary track. And I think that's where Higgins is really carving out her space. She's saying that poetry doesn't just come from the canon, but from the lived, inconvenient, embodied world. From the cough in the room, from the details that don't quite fit into literature.
Yeah, brilliant. And that's actually what makes her so great as a poet, I think. And I'm smiling away listening to the quotes that you were using there, Adam. Brilliant to hear the freshness and vividness of Rita Ann Higgins's voice. And, you know, sometimes when you leave a collection, there's always a poem that you remember that sticks with you and stays with you. I know there is one poem that you particularly liked, Adam,
yeah,
isn't there?
One of the first poems I came across of hers was in Ruth Bedell's brilliant anthology, 52 Ways of Looking at a Poem. And actually, it's actually on page 52 on this anthology, interestingly enough. And it's a great, it's a really striking poem. In the first line goes like this: some people know what it's like to be called a cunt in front of their children. So it gets your attention immediately. And then you get this long list beginning with to be, like to be short for the rent, to wait 2 years to have a tooth looked at, to talk into a banana on a job search scheme. So there's this great dark humour all the way through. And then it intensifies to be looked down on, to be walked on, to be pissed on, to be shat on. And it's almost unbearable at this point. And then the final line, we get a simple "and other people don't." So she just gives that flat throwaway line, and yet it completely reframes everything that's come before it. And I think that's what's so characteristic of Higgins, is that she can do all that in a single turn. So it's funny, it's stark, it's biting, and it's incredibly controlled.
So thanks for that, Adam. And of course, we can't really leave Rita Ann Higgins without saying that this is, of course, a new and selected. So, Adam, there were new poems in this collection as well. So what new poem actually caught your attention?
Yeah, there are some fantastic new poems, and it brings a more sort of reflective, philosophical edge to her work. The title itself, "Jiving with Wasps," comes into focus through a quote by Wu Wei Wu. Are we not wasps who spend all day in a fruitless attempt to traverse a window pane while the other half of the window is wide open? And that first poem, Celsius, is really brilliant. It's a chilling piece. It's framed through this voice of the man to a young girl, and it opens very simply and casually. You can mind the car while I say mass. You can even hop in the back while I say mass. And then another line, "and if you're a good girl, as you often are, I might give you a shilling." And then later, "We can both sit in the back just for the crack. You can give me a blow by blow of your car-minding skills." So it's a poem full of dark subtext. What's not said becomes an example in a way of, how common abuse is. And then there's a lovely closing poem just with these lines. I know we're running out of time, but she says, "Gift us the dove, the olive branch, the years." And I think ending on the word years is just kind of perfect for a book spanning 4 decades. Yeah.
Yeah, well done, Adam. That was such a great reading of Rita Ann Higgins's Jiving with Wasps. And we actually have Rita Ann reading her poem, "The Blanket Man," from this new and selected poems that Adam has just been speaking so eloquently about. So thank you, Adam. We listen to Rita Ann now.
The Blanket Man. He calls in his new Volvo, collecting the £1 a week. Him and his Volvo. Sometimes if she can't pay, he says, come on, missus. If it was my stuff, I'd let you have it for nothing." Leaning against the door jamb, she doesn't believe him. Her and her cigarette.
Next up, we turn to publications from Daedalus Press, who've been producing high-quality poetry books for decades. One book I looked at recently was Fog Bells, 8 contemporary Turkish poets, translated by Neil P. Doherty, who's lived in Istanbul since 1995. So that's a collection I find pretty interesting to delve into. But today, Adam, you wanted to chat about Jerry Smith's new collection, The Turn for Ithaca, as well as Paddy Bush's Uncertain Passage. Both books which were launched recently in the Teachers Club by Pat Bourne. So this is Jerry Smith's 11th collection. So it's a substantial body of work he's produced. What's your sense of this new book and where it sits in his kind of work up to now?
Yeah, I have to say I'm really blown away by this new book. I mean, Smith is a brilliant poet, and I think, this is honestly some of his finest work. There's a great effortless energy to these poems, which are matched with real poise and a sense of craft. It's a collection animated by memory, poetic vocation, and a deeply ingrained sense of literary inheritance. And it opens with a striking sequence of Dublin poems, so elegies, homages, acts of imaginative recovery that immediately establish the book's kind of governing impulse to map a life not just through place, but through the voices and presences that have shaped it. And as soon as you read a poem, you want to read it for its musicality, so you can step back into the world. And it's also one of those collections where as a poet myself, I found myself stopping going, damn, I wish I'd written that. I've dog-eared so many pages of this collection and then realised I had to stop because every poem is just brilliant. And I think anyone interested in writing and the writing life will get so much from this collection. And there's that phrase that people say that Seamus Heaney was the people's poet and Derek Mahon was the poet's poet. And I feel like this is a poet's collection, but not in a closed or exclusive way. The poems are immediate, accessible, but there's also they're deeply engaged with life and writing itself.
Yeah, you do really get a sense, I think, reading this book that he's really an experienced poet. Isn't that right? You can feel the experience and the lived life. And of course, Jerry Smith always writes about one city, the city of Dublin. I mean, I'm sure he has written about other cities too, but Dublin is very, very much present in the book. And did you enjoy that element?
Yeah, it's beautifully done. I mean, but Dublin here, it's not a fixed place. It's layered. It's constantly being rewritten through memory and influence. So at the start, you get these poems, these really moving pieces around Dublin for kind of late influential Dublin poets like Thomas Kinsella, Brendan Kennelly and Evan Boland. But they're not just tributes, they're kind of acts of reanimation, their voices moving through the city. But then the net is flung much further to really, many poetic and artistic influences from like all over and across the centuries. So the first poem kind of sets this up, Song of the Tortured Poet it's called, and it begins with the question, has he squandered a life with a sullen art? And it unfolds through a series of doubts, capturing the uneasy apprenticeship of a writing life. And then towards the end we get these lines of the poet who stayed indoors and fine-tuned the melody, listening for the reticent heartbeat of an ode or elegy. And that line is central to the whole collection, as in many ways every poem in this collection is a kind of ode or elegy for artists and friends near and far. There's poems for Jack Kerouac, there's which is a lovely one called Dharma Bum, and there's a few lines here. He saw his visions in newsreel grey, it begins, a lost brother who stayed in his dreams. Nothing could stop his dance to the rhythms, the beats of typewriter jazz. But then next to this poem, about Jack Kerouac, you get a poem called Orpheus, Virgil and Dante, and it's after the poet Michael Hartnett, an Inchicore man like myself, and the poem begins, poets are dying, leaving other poets to mourn and compose, the requiem, eulogy, elegy, and the mean words of jealousy in a posthumous review.
I mean, I don't know, if I was to ask you the question, I mean, how would you characterise what makes Jerry Smith's the writing itself so distinctive?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that lightness of touch. For me, strong poetry often comes from that balance between the conversational, kind of intimate language, which is balanced with a subtle lyricism. And Smith just gets it exactly right. So, the literary cultural reach of these poems, also it makes me think of the great Polish poet Adam Zagorewski. So he also had that wonderful kind of compelling lightness of touch with these kind of urban poems full of zest, history, politics, while also achieving work that's like deeply thought out, philosophical and even mystical. And it's just beautiful for that.
Yeah, it's a poet, I think, who's really sharpened his attention to the world, hasn't he? And so you really get a deep sense of the world in this collection. And we actually have a recording of Jerry Smith. He's reading his poem, The Silent Era, we were talking about The Turn from Ithaca, his new collection published recently by Daedalus Press. So we listen to Jerry Smith now.
This poem brings us back to that era in Irish life when a culture of silence and secrecy and turning a blind eye surrounded the institutional abuses that ruined so many lives. A time in Irish society that was indeed a silent era. It has taken many brave survivors to open our eyes, minds and hearts to the injustice they endured in mother and baby homes and other institutions under the jurisdiction of church and state. The silent era. Now we have the witness statements. Have found the hidden graves in lonely places. Now the orphans are not afraid to speak. The stolen child has come back to trace her roots. We no longer live in the silent era and know who to blame and who should feel shame in the old school, under the convent bell, in the icy asylum for daughters in distress, its brick and stone saturated with her sweat, kept out of sight, scrubbing the sheets, They missed the time of their lives, the nostalgia years. O Magdalene, your name sounds feather-light, but it bears the weight of crimes far heavier than Judas's betrayal of Christ.
And interesting to hear Jerry Smith's poem there, because now we turn to Anne-Marie Huron, a poet who's never really shied away from revealing the atrocities inflicted on mothers and children in institutions in Ireland. An imaginative, restless voice, and that word restless reveals itself too in the title to her new book of poems, published by Gallery Press, Hymn for the Restless Girls, inspired by the poet and writer Leland Bardwell's autobiography, A Restless Life. Ní Huron herself has said that her collection celebrates the wildness of a girl who's known sometimes as a rebel and a truth speaker. She's been 2025 UCD Arts Council Writer-in-Residence, and many of these poems are drawn from her delving into the National Folklore Collection there. Also, here are poems informed by the Donegal County Archives and the Irish Traditional Music Archive. So this is a book with a very clear subject, histories of abuse and control around women in Ireland. Adam, our reviewer, is sitting here with us. So Adam, I was just wondering, how does Anne-Marie Ní Chuireann avoid this book becoming a kind of documentary?
Yeah, well, first off, I mean, I don't think there's anyone writing quite like Ní Chuireann at the moment. And so, yeah, I mean, I suppose the potential risk with this material is that it can become observational, even documentary. But her genius is how she takes these personal and historical traumas and transmutes them into something elemental, and I'd even say alchemical. So the poems feel seared into the page. She's working deeply intuitively at times, almost as a conduit for something larger than the self. And the collection opens with a quote from Biddy Jenkins, who writes that the poet is by profession a troublemaker. She must be independent to the point of eccentricity. And that's absolutely key to what this collection is doing. These are in many ways poems of those troublemakers, of women who will not stand by, who refuse to be silenced or contained by the systems that have sought to control them. And so Ní Chuireann is taking these restless girls, a term once used to diminish or dismiss, and reclaiming it, so that these women figures of defiance and resistance, whether it's Sinead O'Connor or a young woman made vulnerable, impregnated by an older man and shunned, or Gráinne Whale as well in this collection. So these are the restless girls, those who speak, who keen, who disrupt, who refuse the roles assigned to them.
I love that reference to Biddy Jenkinson, because she is very much a poet, a kind of a fiercely independent, troublemaking kind of poet who refuses to allow her work to be translated from Irish to English. It's translated to other languages. She allows that. But she says of her refusal to allow her work to be translated into English that it's a small, rude gesture, if you like, to the hegemony of English. But I wonder, I mean, can you give us a sense of how, I suppose, Anne-Marie Chuireann's poems work in practice, a sense of the poems, if you like?
Yeah, well, the opening poem, Candle for a Girl Passing Through a Forest, is astonishing, I think. It begins, oh, she does be bold, she does be old as Eve and older still. And so it's her use of language here, it's sort of inverted, archaic, she does be bold, and it sets up this heightened dramatic tension. And it feels like it could be coming from like the weird sisters in Macbeth, that sense of language as spell, as conjuring. And then in the next poem, Self-Portrait as a Fallen Girl, it begins with this other insistent incantatory rhythm. Father, I come to your altar. I come with hands spilling stones. I come draped in a dunghill shawl. I come sin-scented and howling blood moons. And that repetition, I come, it carries all the way through in the poem. And it's kind of devotional at first. It's, of course, disruptive and erotically charged. And then as the poem builds, that voice becomes, more physical and less like a single speaker and more like something collective, something ancestral kind of breaking through. And it ends with these lines, I come for the women who do not come before me. I come for their uncome ghosts. I come for their bodies hungry as grass. I come out of the archives of hunger, and I ask that by this river you kneel for me. And then there's just another standout poem called Bull, and it opens with a question, what business is it to you, says the girl, when asked to name the father of her child? And so it unfolds in a chorus of voices, kind of passing the story along, reshaping it, protecting the man while condemning the girl. And it's brilliantly controlled. The poem exposes how narrative works, how blame is constructed, how it moves and where it lands. And then we're told the man is a good man, a family man, a man who would die for Ireland. island. And then we get this line, he was led astray by a restless girl. And when the priest finally speaks from the pulpit, he's sort of invoking sin and punishment, the language tips into something almost grotesque, and there's that final interruption. Good for him, someone yells. So it's a brilliant piece of work.
So, and Adam, there's also a striking kind of formal experiment going on in the book, is there, at the Raven Chorus poems? It's white text on black pages, isn't it? Yeah, what's she doing here?
Yeah, so in part 3 of the collection, there's these extraordinary Raven Chorus poems. So there's 5 of them, and they're really striking. So as you say, they're printed as white text on black pages, and they read almost like talismans. And these poems kind of draw on that old Irish folkloric practice of watching ravens, reading their movements, their calls, their patterns as a way of interpreting the world. And you really feel that here. And the language in these pieces is just electric. Lines like, musky scent, wolf mothers, we want to run with you beneath the supercharged moon, feather, claw, and scutch of hawthorn, hurling our hungry bodies along your path. So the writing is kind of visceral and feral in its intensity. And it's not a usual narrative. What Nicharon is doing is turning the raven into a kind of chorus, again, a kind of collective voice with this we call, we trill. And it becomes a voice for the marginalised, the outcast, the silenced.
Yeah, it just sounds nearly mesmeric, Adam. Thank you for that wonderful review there. And we actually have Anne-Marie reading now. She's reading a poem called Hail, Queen of Heaven, from Hymn for the Restless Girls, published by Gallery Press.
In 1985, 3 teenage girls were walking down a country road in Sligo when they had an apparition of the Virgin Mary. This poem was made using the images and language of their testimony. Hail, Queen of Heaven. On Monday night last, Diane was here from England. You could see an unusual mist falling. We were in the road. When I looked up and I saw clouds parting like smoke, I saw the face of Our Lady in the moon, angels swirling at her head. Swaying from the waist up, I felt a heat rising through my body. Frozen, I could not move. I was drowning in the scent of her roses. I was afraid. I was overcome by her lips moving to the words faith and hope. I was all alone. I reached out to touch Diane, and we could see the Lord forming in the sky. We were singing, Hail, Queen of Heaven. We were covered in a shining light. Our mothers saw a strange star that night. A cameraman saw it too, but the camera saw nothing. It all happened at 9:20. We thought, who is going to believe us?
And now to Billy Ramsell, a book called Render. Billy has published 2 collections with the Daedalus Press, Complicated Pleasures, which came out in 2007, and The Architect's Dream of Winter, very interesting book, which came out in 2013. It was shortlisted for the Irish Times Poetry Now Award when it came out, and it's recently appeared in Italian translation. He was awarded the Chair of Ireland Bursary for 2013, and he's been shortlisted for several other prizes. And Render is a Poetry Society recommendation, and it's going to come out very soon from Banshee Press. And it's a pretty unusual book, Adam, isn't it? I mean, it's presented as the selected work of a fictional poet, Alberto Senath, son of a wealthy kind of Catalan family. Shades of Fernando Pessoa, maybe, or a book I like came out years ago, Peter Russell's The Elegies of Quintilius, or Christopher Reed's Caterina Brack, that kind of thing where a poet pretends to be a quite other person. But it's a bit of a significant departure for Ramsell. What's he done here?
Yeah, so as you say, he's invented this whole other poet for a new work. And so what follows is presented as Alberto Senath's selected poems. So it's 5 imagined volumes, so a whole life in writing. And as you say, it might sound unusual, but it's actually, there's quite a long tradition. There's the Portuguese poet Pessoa, his heteronyms, Ezra Pound's Personae, and Browning's dramatic voices. There's an epigraph at the start from W.R. Rogers that says, "The only duty of the writer is disloyalty." So Ramsell is playing with this disloyalty to the autobiographical self, to the expected lyric I. And Paul Muldoon turned that creative writing mantra on its head, which is write what you know and find your own voice. And he said, lose your voice and write about what you don't know. And that's exactly what Billy's doing here.
Yeah, it's fun, it's inventive and imaginative. And we were speaking earlier about Jerry Smith's Dublin. In this book, we've got Barcelona, haven't we? And what does that bring to the collection, Adam?
Yeah, everything. I mean, look, Ramsell does lush, sensuous language, extraordinarily well. I honestly don't think I've read many poets who rend a place with that kind of romantic intensity. So Barcelona comes alive as sensuous, political, artistic. It's a city of heat and bodies and memory. There's a beautiful poem near the start called Dusk and Tomatoes, and it unfolds like a film scene with this wonderful Mediterranean late 70s vibe, almost the feeling of like the talented Mr. Ripley. It opens with, Elena, we will make a fine stew, a broth of albondingas, of rabbit and wine. It will simmer lasciviously. So it's very erotically charged, it's rhapsodic, and he carries it off completely. And then the poem widens out to the room, the balcony, the square, and various figures drifting through. I sip Lambrusco on the balcony and imagine that you're coming. You could be coming with a tray of Montserrat tomatoes, wrinkled, ridged, irregular, straining to contain themselves. So it's this wonderfully rich poem. And then just these final four lines I'd love to read. Oh, do come and join us, Elena. Come and bring impossible tomatoes. Come and bring a bottle of the twilight. Bring two, Elena. We'll make a fine stew.
I love those impossible tomatoes, but it's very self-consciously European in a way. I mean, it's the way in which it grounds itself in this culture. It constantly refers to the things and objects and its language. I mean, there's a poem which almost reminded me of a poem by Francis Ponge, his brilliant poem on rain. And we have here a short essay on rain. And on the breeze, the tang of rain arouses the pavements, the tar macadam of Paris Street, Montaner Street. Then rain in a lisping mist repeats itself on all the canopies of Balm Street, and then it goes on and creates this whole thing. But very kind of a very European kind of poem. But going back to the title, it's called Render, and that seems to carry a lot of weight. So what does render mean in the context of this?
Yeah, so to render is to translate, process, transform, but also to reduce and to dissolve. And that doubleness runs through the whole book. So sound, memory, language, even the self, everything feels like a form of imperfect transfer. There's a brilliant prose poem called Inventory in the middle section, and it's about sorting through his father's belongings after his death, a notary box, a lambskin diary, a desktop humidor, and every object really becomes a question about what we inherit. And by the end of the poem becomes something larger than inheritance. It's about what we can and can't understand about the lives that came before us. So the act of sorting through objects becomes a way of asking, what does it mean to inherit a life? So the title Render begins to open something deeper. In one poem, sound is described as the only true vocabulary of nature, and everything else becomes, approximation, a kind of failed encoding. And in one of the final poems, like Things No Longer There, memory is not just unreliable, it's like actively breaking down. The page itself becomes wounded, redacted, and language collapses under pressure, and what remains feels ghostly, partial. So it's a deeply intelligent, formally accomplished, and emotionally elusive book. It offers not just poems to read, but like a life to enter.
That's great. And here we have Billy Ramsell reading his poem, The White Bed, from Render now, and it's published by Banshee Press.
The White Bed. My brother lay down in a bed of ice, laundered, yielding as one might wish for. I stole this image from Anthony Tapis. My brother handled balance sheets with such grace, could trap a football like Gladio, but then he lay down on a bed of ice. My brother on his silken skis was crossing half the cold breath of Andorra. I steal another image from Tapis. The pinks of number 40, its bars of light, to show the luminescence of my brother before he left us for his bed of ice. How pallid they are, these Christmas skies. My mother makes roast guinea fowl, she makes torrons. I gift myself an etching by Tapis. I say, brother, brother, come and join us, please. The door to our warm drawing room's ajar now. But he won't get up, will he, from his bed of ice? So I borrow his freezing image from Tapis.
And now to Paddy Bush's new collection, Uncertain Passage, published by Daedalus Press. Paddy Bush was born in Dublin in 1948 and he now lives in Waterville, County Kerry. He writes in Irish and in English and he's an accomplished translator. The Rolling Wave on RT Radio 1 in November 2022, in fact, devoted an entire show to Paddy Bush's poems and the tunes and songs they respond to. And it's still actually available, that show. And his new book, Uncertain Passage, is a book of praise for both singers and songs, a book of thanks for luck and travel and wonders, and a recognition that, as he says, in my 75th year, I know the time is right for planting trees. So, Adam, can you talk to us about this book and what you encountered in the book in the realms of these poems and what's really at the heart of it, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, a bit like what I was just saying there at the end of Render regarding language. At the heart of Uncertain Passage is this persistent concern with the limits of language, the conditions under which meaning is made or lost. So a lot of the poems are set around Kerry, but what struck me straight away is how much the book is about music and about poetry itself. The opening poem, Accompanist, captures the almost sacred attention between a singer and a musician, reaching, he writes, a note of such intimacy that it resonates beyond all language, and the listening poet once more weeping for the meagreness of words. So here's a poet working in language, but recognising its inadequacy. And that tension runs through everything.
And I'm just wondering how that kind of preoccupation develops as the collection moves forward.
Yes, it deepens and intensifies. There's another lovely poem, Tabula Rasa, written after the composer Arvo Part, and it asks, does listening create what is heard? The sound bring forth the creature uttering the sound. So it's this idea that attention itself might shape what comes into being. In another poem, Language Loss, a bird sings in despairing search of its own words. And then in the third section, Bush turns to a cancer diagnosis, and suddenly the question of how we translate experience becomes urgently personal. So he's back on the coast watching seals, but seeing them through the uncertain lens of yesterday's meeting in the hospital, he writes. The outer landscape and inner experience begin to mirror each other in a very powerful way. Again, it comes back to language or the limits of it. He writes, I have not yet found the words to translate what our eyes read. And that word translate is so important because the whole collection is circling that. How do we translate experience? How do we make sense of what's happening, especially when it's something so profound as illness? And then the next poem, Intensive Unit, as Rainforest holds the title of the collection, and it's a metamorphosis. The ward hummed and pulsed and whistled itself into rainforest, he writes, while I was still migrant, a bird of uncertain passage. So he goes from watching and reading nature and in doing so, kind of becoming one with it and is transformed by it.
Yeah, and I love as well that the last poem is called Meditation Bowl, and it's actually a sequence of haiku from a tourist shop. Yes, but strike the bowl gently and it still rings true. And just listening to you there, Adam, I think it's a lovely way to end a collection which seems to ring true, doesn't it? Do you want to say a little bit about the haiku at the end and what you liked about it?
So there's a beautiful sequence of haiku, so of like watching animals, walking in nature, listening to wind chimes, and then finally, as you say, that meditation bowl, which is so beautiful. So it's like after everything, after this language, silence, illness and landscape, it comes back to that simple act of attention, of listening. Yeah. So it's a really beautiful, sensitive piece of work.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Adam. Thank you so much. And I remember reading a poem from this forthcoming collection in the Irish Times about his illness, and I thought it was absolutely wonderful. So it's powerful stuff. So thanks to Paddy Bush for that beautiful book, Uncertain Passage, and to Adam for talking about it there. And we're going to now have Paddy Bush reading his poem, Stone Seal, from An Uncertain Passage, recently published by Daedalus Press. So here we go.
Stone Seal. Gleaned from the high tide shingle on the beach below our house. It rests now on the windowsill beside my desk, grey sandstone flanks seamlessly curving up to form a raised tail, a watchful head. The seam of quartzite it perched on, aeons ago, mirrors the wavelets just breaking on the rocks offshore, where seals have just now hauled up to bask for however long today's tide will allow.
Moving on now to Jamie O'Halloran's Ballast, which was published by Drunk Muse Press. And Jamie was born in the United States, but she's now an Irish citizen and she's made her home in County Galway. Her collection comes with high praise from poet that we are familiar with, Mark Roper, who tells us it's much to admire in these trustworthy, gentle, balanced, undeceived poems. This is a debut from a press maybe many won't have heard of. So, how did it come to your attention, Adam?
Yeah, sometimes a book falls into your lap, which you may not have come across, and you're really grateful for it. So in this case, it was down to you, Peter and Enda. So thank you for choosing this collection, as this is one of those books. The collection is published by Drunk Muse Press, and it's a press I haven't heard of before. And it may not get have the visibility of the larger houses, but which is clearly recognise something exceptional here. And I think that matters because collections like this can too easily slip beneath the radar, in a landscape that often privileges scale and reputation over quiet brilliance. So what O'Halloran has produced here is a work of real depth and authority, and it deserves to travel to readers, to anthologies, to prize lists. So, it's a plea in a way to all independent houses, sort of beg, borrow, steal to get your poets in shops and on prize lists.
Yeah, very important. And very important that Books for Breakfast always pays attention to lovely books like this. And actually, Jamie O'Halloran sent it on to us. And I opened it actually on a poem called Waking. And I think she's got a very simple, elegant way of writing. I'll just read this little poem. Out the window, the chalky moon that nests in my thumbnail is stuck over Cloosh Hill. I can see the windpark scarecrow arms swiping the air with the birds. The sky is whitewashed, rinsed of the night before, when it had emptied itself of cloud and Orion's belt was a studded brilliance. That was when we fixed ourselves on the dark lane beside the towering laurel, struck by living so close to the stars. It's so beautiful, and it's in short little couplets, and I thought it's really beautiful. So Jamie O'Halloran, Adam, she was born along the Atlantic and Pacific coast of the United States. She's now based in Galway. So do you think she kind of brings a transatlantic sensibility to her work?
Yeah, absolutely. It does seem to be evident. You think of poets like Marie Howe, and she's a poet who's sort of deeply attuned to landscape, memory, and the presence of the dead in this collection. And it opens with the striking poem Visitation, where a barn owl appears, moth quiet above our heads, just past moonrise. And the collection is full of these arresting images, like the poem you read out. The owl, she writes, with its valentine face, blanched against night. In another age, she suggests, we'd have called her ghost. And this sense of threshold between worlds, between states of being, is central to the collection. And then from here, Ballast moves into meditations on counting, naming, and the subtle transformations of grief. The poems are often brief, they're kind of sonnet-like meditations, but they carry great depth and resonance. And there's a sense throughout that the dead are not gone, but have simply altered form, becoming trees, surf, memory, breath. In the poem Number, the speaker begins by counting trees, so grounding us in the physical world, but then the poem turns quietly and the trees become stand-ins for the dead, friends who have stiffened into trees, she writes. The act of counting becomes an act of mourning, of keeping track of absence.
Yeah, mourning seems to be a thing in a sense that the collection deals with very serious loss. I'm noticing that that's a very kind of strong thread throughout the collection. And how does she handle that?
Yeah, in poems such as The Gone, she moves fluidly between personal grief and mythic structures, invoking figures like Lazarus and Persephone, allowing these archetypes to illuminate her own loss. And she always writes with this amazingly kind of honed, calm voice. There's a restraint that allows the lyricism to emerge subtly. It's never overstated. And then elsewhere in the collection, she deepens this atmosphere of grief, turning towards the devastating losses that shape much of the collection, the death of a mother, and father, and even more piercingly, the loss of a daughter. So these are not abstract elegies. They're lived, embodied experiences, and they're rendered with an honesty that never flinches. Unplugged is a particularly stark example. So here the poet confronts the physical reality of dying with extraordinary clarity. She acknowledges what many would rather look away from, that death is often undignified while still finding a strange, attentive grace within it. And then in the poem Breakfast Myths, which is perhaps the emotional centre of the collection, she brings together the domestic and the mythic with striking ease. The poem begins in the aftermath of dreams of a dead child and a dying parent, and moves through a kind of symbolic landscape where everyday rituals, breakfast, conversation become charged with deeper meaning. But it's really a stunning debut, one that understands grief not as something to be resolved, but as something we live alongside, that we carry within us.
And also, Adam, I love as well that you drew comparisons with her work and the work of poets like Kerry Hardy or Jane Hirschfield as well. So it's kind of an elemental, isn't there, meditative quality to her work, which is lovely. But we do have a recording of Jamie O'Halloran reading her poem Retreat from Ballast, published by Drunk Muse Press.
Retreat. Wrap me here in night, where slender shutters allow only a blink of dawn. Shelter me the way a mussel shell harbors its soft body. Armor me against the seeing time when nothing is the best I can do, here where only birds cross the sky and only catkins fall. Leave me in this lack of light, where I'll be safe and the duvet's downy layers will spread their own sheen, numbing the irritant day, pearling the morning back into dream.
And finally, we move to Neanderthal Boy by Colm Scully, published by Words on the Street. Scully is a Cork poet, short story writer, filmmaker, and in this new book, the past and present intertwine. And the collection has a very wide temporal canvas, doesn't it, Adam? What holds it together, do you think?
Yeah, so Scully is exploring the space, between the historical, and scholarship where they meet. And so he provides the reader with this persistent sense that history is not something distant, but something lived and inherited. The opening poem, Alexandria, places the ancient Greek mathematician Eratosthenes measuring the world in shadow and light. And then it moves seamlessly to the Bandon River and the old head of Kinsale, so collapsing geography and time into a single imaginative field. And then in the poem Homo sapiens sapiens, he demythologizes the Tuatha De Danann. They had stumpy feet and raised brows, he writes. They walked with a constant stoop. And when the Milesians arrive, they simply repeat the same patterns, drawing the same circles on the same standing stones. And then he asks at the end, where does the spiral end? No one may ever know. And that's kind of the crux of what these poems are exploring. History folding back on itself, inheritance repeating.
Yeah, and as Matthew Gedden says as well, it's exploring the margins of history and the simple beauty in fleeting everyday moments, which is a lovely quote at the back of the book.
Yeah, and is there kind of like an intimate counterweight to all that deep time?
Yeah. So between these poems of ancient history and evolution are more personal poems of family. There's a poem called The Electrician. It's this beautiful elegy for the poet's father, the sweet spot on an old pair of pliers becoming a form of inheritance that's practical, tactile, and emotional all at once. I'll grab its taped up handle and together we'll find that sweet spot, he writes. And that word together does everything. The father still present in the gesture, in the muscle memory. And then there are smaller, quieter poems like Tea Ceremony for One, where everything narrows down to the present moment. The boiling kettle, the steeping tea, the empty house, the same patterns of inheritance happening on the most intimate scale.
Yeah, and he writes, I sit stone still, master and guest, lipping infusions, waiting for words. That's beautiful, from Tea Ceremony for One. So thanks for mentioning that poem, Adam. And the collection ends in Syria. How does Scully bring the historical and the contemporary together here?
Yeah, so there's another poem called Lord Protector, and it's written in Cromwell's voice, and he uses, the language of piety to expose how ideology justifies violence, and so it doesn't feel distant. You can see the echoes today, figures invoking faith and moral authority, while what they say and do sits, uneasily with those values. And then in the title poem Neanderthal Boy, Scully explores a prehistoric consciousness, a speaker moving through a landscape of survival and threat. But again, underneath that, there's a familial thread. The father teaching the land to his son, the boundaries, the patterns. So the poem becomes a meditation on what it means to belong, to inherit, to be shaped by forces both ancient and immediate. And yes, so in that final poem, Syria, it closes everything. He writes, Syria sits in darkness. The doctors have left for Europe. The young men have joined the resistance. And it ends back into history throughout the collection. Scully's been showing us something about the present all along. You know, by bringing us right up to the present, it reminds us that history isn't something abstract and distant. So it's a really thoughtful, wide-reaching, but also intimate collection. You know, it asks big questions about ancestry, belonging, and the stories we tell ourselves about who we are.
Yeah, and that last question really, I mean, it lands with huge weight. What can we do to end the war? And that's from the poem Syria, Neanderthal Boy. And we do actually have Colm Scully reading the title poem. But first of all, we just want to say thanks so much to Adam Wyeth for coming in today. I mean, my gosh, we've gone through so many books, being our brilliant poetry reviewer. And of course, huge thanks to all the poets, Rishan Higgins, Jerry Smith, Anne-Marie Huron, Billy Ramsell, Paddy Bush, Jamie O'Halloran and Colm Scully. Congratulations on your new collections from Books for Breakfast, and may the poems soar. And as usual, details of all books will be available on www.booksforbreakfast.com. But let's go out now listening to Colm Scully reading Neanderthal Boy, the title poem of his new collection from Words on the Street.
The following poem is in the voice of a Neanderthal boy, set in prehistory, when Neanderthals struggled for survival against their ascendant competitors, Homo sapiens. Neanderthal Boy. These are the last few stretches of moorland. Beyond that it's the sea. If I follow the coastline for 2 days, I know there was a tribe of us in the hills. My father brought me there, taught me patterns of the land, showed me the boundary lines with the humans, agreed in stone before the gods. I move swiftly through the grasses. My swollen feet tread only at night. They travel in bands, I watch for them, flailing spears stolen from us. They used the boundary stones to attack us, their hairless chests, their ochred eyes. I break onto the beach when the moon is covered. The gods say someday they will turn on themselves.
Now we're going to hear from Joe Woods, who's going to tell us about the Strokestown Poetry Festival, which starts actually tomorrow and goes on until Sunday, and which features your good self, Adam, in a special event, which we'll hear about also from Joe, celebrating
45 years of publishing, yeah, which is extraordinary. Yeah. Yeah, so really looking forward to this celebratory reading with several other brilliant salmon poets.
Just remind us what day that is. All these details are available on strokestownpoetryfest.ie, and there's lots of other poets reading there. Afric McKay is reading, so is Dermot Bodger, so is Michael O'Loughlin, so there's
Elaine Quillen's giving a talk as well. But really, congratulations to Salmon Press and to Jessie Lendenny and to Siobhan. It's a huge achievement, 45 years, fantastic. So Adam, I bet you're looking forward to that, are you?
I am, yeah, I can't wait.
Well,
yeah,
that's great. So reviewing and poetry readings, you're a busy boy, Adam Wyeth. Thank you so much. And we move on now to Joseph Woods.
The Maybank holiday weekend is synonymous with the Strokestown Poetry Festival, and this year is no different. The festival opens tomorrow and it runs until Sunday. So we're here with Joe Woods, festival director, and he's on the line from Malawi, where he lives with his family. So you're very welcome to Books for Breakfast, Joe. Just, you're there in Malawi. Just tell us a little bit, how are things in Malawi?
Well, the weather is absolutely beautiful. It's about 26 degrees, but and I really like living here. But it's got its problems at the moment. The fuel queues, there's complete lack of fuel in the country, and we went from at the beginning of the year having the cheapest fuel in the African continent to the most expensive and
that's because of the war.
It's because absolutely, and there's a complete lack of foreign currency in the country, and it's just resulted. So the petrol queues are tremendous, and as we speak, you probably wouldn't hear it there, but there's a generator in the background because we've an all-day power cut, which are frequent and regular. But there's pluses and minuses. It's a beautiful, beautiful country, and there's I mean it's just beautiful countryside, and it's very close to nature in every sense.
That must be good. I mean, but getting back to the festival, how do you manage to run a festival in Strokestown from Malawi?
Well, the funny thing is, when I put it to the chairman 2 years ago, he didn't really seem to think it was a problem. I was living in Limerick at the time, and at the time we were kind of doing
a difference.
Quite a difference. But at the time we were, possibly because of COVID, we were doing a lot of our, pretty much all of our meetings were online, and they were on Zoom. And I suppose that one of the big things, Peter, was I'd kind of set up, because I've been doing the festival. I'm doing the festival now for 5 years. So I'd kind of set up all the contacts, all the necessary links with the venue and with everything, and the technical side of things. So they're just, and WhatsApp, it's extraordinary. Like I had a couple of meetings this week and just on WhatsApp, and it was just like I might as well have been down the road. So in one sense, it's very handy. It's very handy. You don't have that necessary sense of kind of bumping into people and meeting people along the way, at readings, and so you're kind of judging things from afar in terms of putting a program together. But I think that has its advantages as well. And
you can keep up with what's happening in kind of Irish poetry and stuff.
Yeah, very much so. Like I would kind of keep up with very much kind of new titles coming out and what's being reviewed, and the journals, keeping a kind of a weather eye, on what's happening and what's going down. And also I also like to kind of keep an eye on other festivals. I think Courage is taking place at the moment, and I'm always interested to see what's happening there.
Okay, well let's have a look at some of the highlights. I mean we're trying to get people to get on a bus or get in a car and drive down to Strokestown. So what are some of the things they can expect to see down there this year?
Well, there's a very good bus service, which I was only made aware of the other night. There's a very good bus service from Dublin. But no, I would make an open call, and in a sense, it's wonderful to have people coming down. We're very open to people coming on any of the days over the weekend. But we're kicking off Friday with three readers. Moya Cannon, who's known to everybody, I think, in Irish poetry. Louise Cole, and Louise is very much a locally based poet, and then Chandrika Narayan Mohan, who is bringing out a new book with Daedalus Press. So that'll be really kind of interesting reading to kick things off. It's kind of a reading and partial book launch. We're going to follow that up with some music, a local traditional quartet called Rhythm. And then we'll finish off that evening with it's a really, really successful kind of open mic that takes place. It takes place throughout the year, but we're kind of linking in with it on the basis of the festival.
And where do those events take place? They're in Strokestown House itself, are they?
Yes. All our events for the weekend, and that's the fantastic thing, is it's in Strokestown Park House. And a lot of you will know it as it's also the National Famine Museum, and it's a real icon and a kind of iconic building in that part of the world. But it's a fantastic venue, and with the exception, I should say, of the open mic, because we have that in a pub in town. With that exception, all our events are under the one roof of Strokestown Park House.
Yeah, it's great kind of atmosphere. I remember being last year, and I also remember because last year,
yes,
I gave a lecture myself, but it was the one. It's the annual Joan McBreen lecture, and I think this year you have Elaine Nicholanon giving that. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, actually, that's interesting because your lecture, I'm delighted to say, is actually up on the website, and advise people to go to the website to look for there's lots of other content on the website, but we're delighted to have that up there. But this year we have Elaine Nicholanon, and she is going to speak on readers of poetry, the lamented reader of poetry, and I think that's going to be a very, very interesting talk. Because
and do they exist? Do they exist? Number one, are there any readers?
I'm going to be very. Actually, it'll be fascinating because, like, as subject matter, we always kind of like it to be a little bit left of centre. That was the whole idea of the talk. And when Elaine kind of came back to me with this idea, I just thought it's brilliant. It's brilliant because I think it's something that we all worry about and wonder about. You know, I suppose the thing, Peter, is to find someone who reads poetry and doesn't write it. I think that's the real.
That's the thing. Yeah. I've never seen one of those people. But anyway, we live in hope. But the other thing, speaking about poetry, Joe, is that it's 45 years. I mean, again, all these milestones I find hard to kind of believe because, they're just reminders of how old we're all getting. But like, it's 45 years now since, I feel like it's 150 years since this and that happened. You keep reminding me. It's 45 years since Salmon Press was founded. And I see that you've got a special event to mark that.
Yeah, I mean we were really. I was talking to Jessie Lendenny, who's the overall founder and director of Salmon Poetry, and Jessie mentioned this to me about a year and a half ago, and I actually couldn't believe it, Peter. Yeah. I just couldn't fathom it because when I joined Poetry Ireland a long, long time ago, I mean, Salmon Press felt like a kind of a new press at the time, right. And it's quite extraordinary, and we've got a really good representative readers in sense of from Salmon. We've got Rachel Hegarty, Joan McBreen, Jessamine O'Connor, who again is a locally based poet. And also a novelist as well. She's bringing out a new novel. And Nessa O'Mahony and Adam Wyeth. So that's I think it's a really good lineup, and that'll be an excellent reading, I think. And it's just it's very much about I think representative of the whole diversity of salmon and who they've published over the years. I mean, you could really play around with that lineup because it's there's such a fantastic line, Yeah, it's an extensive list, and it's very, very impressive. And I should also say that we're delighted this year to have, because Salmon Poetry has also branched out to being a bookshop in Ennistimon, a very, very fine bookshop that I was often in when I lived in Limerick. And we're delighted this year that the Salmon Bookshop is going to be in situ at the house, and they'll have books by every author over the weekend. So that's a great opportunity as well to pick up books.
That's great. You mentioned Rachel Hegarty there, and of course it reminded me that one of the things that people most associate with Strokestown, of course, is the annual poetry competition, and Rachel Hegarty is this year's judge. And I'm looking at a list of the shortlisted poets, some of whom are familiar to me, but there's Amy Barry with a poem called A House of Daughters, Marion Brannigan, The Stray Away Child, Catherine Ann Cullen, who has been, I know, nominated before for this prize. The Mother is her poem, Conor McAnally, Kindred Spirits, and Tom Noon with a poem called Kingfisher. And Rachel, she commented, she said that, it's a delight to read the nearly 700 entries, which is, again, impressive. Proof positive, she says, the poetry is alive and well on and off the island of Ireland. So she said it's a bit of a bittersweet honour to be able to only choose 5 poems out of that kind of treasure trove. But she praises the 5 finalists there, and they all read, don't they?
They do indeed, Peter. And the thing is, you mentioned the amount of entries there. It was just before we closed on the competition this year. I was reading the Telegraph in the UK had a poetry competition, and they were raving about having something in the region of 600 entries. And I remember thinking at the time, golly, because we closed on something close to 700 afterwards, and I was thinking it's a completely different catchment, the Telegraph to Strokestown. So it's kind of testament to how kind of successful the competition is. We're inviting all 5 shortlisted poets to come down and give a short reading. Instead of just reading out a single poem, we give them a short reading, and we'll kind of hear what they're about, and then there's going to be a sudden death announcement by Rachel, who will announce the winner. And we, again, if you go to the website, you'll see the shortlisted poems. It's really good to have a good look at them. There's kind of always a little bit of debate as to who will walk away with the prize.
Okay, so we can put a few quid on that and see what happens. Yeah. Well, listen, Joe, that's just a snippet. I mean, that's just that's a kind of a snippet of some of the things that are happening, and it's all happening from tomorrow onwards. So you still time to book your bus ticket, or you can get a train to Longford, or you can get a taxi from there, or you can jump in your car.
Exactly. Yeah. Or I think there's a good service there again.
There is, and I have been there many times myself, and it's always a very enjoyable experience. And it's one of the few kind of poetry-only festivals left these days. There aren't very many. I know there's the one in Cork,
yes,
and Strokestown. So there aren't very many poetry festivals left, really, and it's a good thing that they are there. And thanks again to Joe Woods for talking to us all the way from Malawi about this year's Strokestown Festival, which starts tomorrow, and you can get the full programme on the website strokestownpoetryfest.ie.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee, and I'm Enda Wiley, and I have Peter Sirr here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.